Throughout my life in elementary, middle, and high school, I have always had this resentment when learning history, specifically American history. But then I slowly began to realize that teachers, institutions, and even Congress were censoring America's dark past. Topics that essentially would create discussion about racial tension, current social issues, and the outbreaks of war, given that context. However, in this podcast, Redesigning America, I really want to uncover the true roots of American movements, laws, and ideologies that were hidden away from school books and classes. And my first topic for today is manifest destiny. Now, it can be seen in two lenses: religion or an economic opportunity, or even both, as over 900,000 square miles were given to the American people, especially farmers in the South, after a lot of resources were diminishing and their land wasn't getting as much sources as it would provide. But reality, the main purpose was really to spread the virtues of the American people and their institutions, their values, a mission to redeem and remake the West into an irresistible destiny that can provide religious tolerance, wealth, democracy. But deep down, that was what history wants you to think. Supported by personal letters, acts, and encouragements from other leaders, religion and an economy was a label to the movement. But in the end, Manifest Destiny was a racial motivated movement rather than an economic and religious one, as the American government encouraged explorers and settlers to display this nation's sense of racial supremacy and domination, especially during the aggressive interactions with Native Americans and Mexicans. The Indian Removal Act and the Mexican-American War were major events that occurred during this period of expansionism that supports the argument that this was a forceful and racist push to take over the western frontier. Now, in this discussion, I'll be showing and overviewing three presidencies. Thomas Jefferson, who was the initiator for Manifest Destiny. Then we have Andrew Jackson, who went through with the Indian Removal Act. And then you have James Polk with the Mexican-American War, which was a pretty significant instigating of the racial factor. Now let's get into it with Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was actually a very interesting character. His father was a surveyor who befriended a lot of native tribes, and so did Thomas Jefferson growing up in his childhood. And so that wasn't the only thing that captured his eye. It was the vast land that he lived on. He grew up in the western part of Virginia. And so seeing that, he noticed that there was a lot of land that America hasn't explored yet. So this inspired him. Before entering presidency, he was really pushing for western exploration. But under Washington and Adams, they were already busy building the foundations of a nation. So it wasn't too high on their priority list. However, that changed from 1801 to 1809, when Thomas Jefferson entered the office with the theme that changed America forever: Empire of Liberty. An encouragement to expand west and spread democracy and freedom. In a Saxon journal foreshadowing Manifest Destiny by Joel Korvosky, he mentioned that Jefferson took the 800,000 square miles to facilitate future scientific developments, land claims, and commerce. But there was a minority group that was in the way: Native Americans. So before and in the beginning of his presidency, he really was focused on incorporating these Indians into American society, but they kept resisting. So he set out policies for peace, respect, protecting their rights, and established commerce with them. He thought them as these noble savages, like I mentioned before, but their culture was still in a way uncivilized, in the way they act, dressed, and ate. So he tried to train and encourage them to integrate themselves into the American society. During the year of the Lewis and Clark expedition, he actually sent a message to Andrew Jackson, ironic, saying, "Towards the attachment of our two objects of peace and lands, is it essential that our agent acquire that sort of influence over the Indians which rests on confidence." So he had confidence that they were going to help and integrate and encourage them, and so in the arts and farming and what you think as civilized back in the day. However, this kind of is ironic. His legacy is actually ironic. Given Jefferson was a man of the Enlightenment age and a Secretary of State with the interest of supporting the Indian sovereignty and equality, these views kind of conflicted as they were subordinate during his presidency to concerns of national security, to preserve the Union, and to advance the interests and needs of his political party. So, a year before that, in 1802, he wrote again to his friend Alexander von Humboldt, mentioning to teach them agriculture and rudiments of most necessary arts, to encourage industry by establishing among them separate property. So he said, let them keep their land, but they need to be civilized for them to be and to cooperate with our society. That didn't really work out too well. Actually, this frustrated them when he kept being rejected by the Indians, especially the Indian nations. So this put a lot of weight on him. So he began to not take kindly to American Indians. His hostilities and our legions are complex. He began not to take too kindly of these American Indians. His hostilities became really complex. He was conflicted. He liked Native Americans. He thought of them highly. But the more they rejected him, the more he felt frustrated, and his anger actually started increasing. So he actually became the originator of the United States government's ethnic cleansing policies of the early 19th century term Indian removal. In his memorandum for Henry Dearborn, his Secretary of War during his presidency, on Indian policy in 1802 to 1803, they wrote a lot during this period, but this one really stood out. And he mentioned that they should first gain the goodwill of these tribes by friendly acts of their chiefs by largesses, and then propose to run the line between them, to claim whatever can be said to be doubtful, offering them liberal price of their pretensions, and even endeavoring to obtain from them cessions of much of their acknowledged territory as they will be induced to part with. However, if we are constrained to lift the hatchet against any tribe, we will never lay it down until that tribe is exterminated or driven beyond the Mississippi. You can see that sense of frustration. While he was settled on this Indian removal policy, which obviously did not pass, this created more tension as his plan of peace or agreement kept failing with the natives, especially with the chiefs of the great nations and Indian nations. There is a hint of revenge and frustration within that letter, which can be taken out of context with the future presidents, such as Andrew Jackson, that will enter this new movement of manifest destiny. For example, in his letter again to Alex, especially in 1813, way after his presidency, there is a sense of attack and anger that his ideology of civilization and culture fell through. He mentioned that they had to cut off all possibility of intercourse and of mutual aid, and may pursue at our leisure whatever plan we must find to secure ourselves against the future effects of their savages and ruthless warfare, to confer brutalization, if not the extermination of this race of America. Once again, he mentioned the word extermination. Kind of strong word, but you can sense that anger. And then he says again, the natives have seduced a greater part of the tribes within our neighborhood to take up a hatchet against us. The cruel massacres they have committed on women and children on our frontiers, taken by surprise, will oblige us now to pursue them to extermination. You can see that there is a lot of understanding that he is willing to get rid of these natives in order for his lifestyle, the American society lifestyle, to continue on. If they can't coexist and integrate into our race, measures will be taken. So while there is understanding that natives have been attacking settlers, and I'm not trying to get away from that, there was something that they have warned the government about. They felt attacked and betrayed by Jefferson, and the idea that all they wanted was seclusion and a balance of lands between each other and respect for each other's lifestyle. But Jefferson wasn't having it. Jefferson had this forewarning that he was ready to exterminate with military, even sending a letter to Indian nations in 1808 that he was hurt by their rejection of their civilized people's society. No nation rejecting our friendship and commencing wanton and unprovoked war against us shall ever after remain within our reach. It shall never be in our power to strike us a second time. And like I said, this was to an Indian nations 1808. So you can see that frustration, even though it got really aggressive as years gone by, and you can't blame that he's trying to get more land and more of his population growth and out there and more successful with wealth. It's just Jefferson started the propaganda and hatred towards Native Americans, leading the people to believe that their race is superior and rightful to that land that they already have been taking, that their lifestyle should be the only one seen in America. And they're embarrassed by the fact that a culture is denying something that the rest of the world is seeing, the French, the Spanish. Now that we have an understanding in what is developing this wave in the sense of race domination that was from the Lewis and Clark expedition and Louisiana Purchase. Granted, I'm not saying Lewis and Clark expedition caused it, as he did tell the two explorers to be civilized and actually have a good relationship with them. You can still see that sense of, okay, this is how they live and this is how we want to change it because our way is the better way. Let's meet the man that actually went through with the Indian Removal Act. causing thousands to suffer and die, all in the name of liberty, democracy, and racial supremacy. Now, Jackson had a similar goal of getting people away from the coastline, but he had a completely different ideology when it came to Manifest Destiny. As the country was expanding westward little by little, it wasn't until Andrew Jackson's election that really allowed the movement to kickstart. Manifest Destiny slowly shifted from this exploration and new opportunity movement to a more racial one, using religion as a way to justify its aggressiveness and assertiveness, especially towards, once again, Native Americans. With the ideas of Jacksonian democracy in the air, majority of the population, especially in the South, were encouraged and motivated to explore these lands because it was their God-given right and their divine destiny to establish on earth moral dignity and salvation of man, as the famous editor John L. O'Sullivan put it. Now, Andrew Jackson's presidency was now focused on the idea of extending freedom to the untouched areas of the West. But once again, as Thomas Jefferson warned him about, Native tribes will not move as they were beginning to lose their patience with the constant poking and aggression that they have been receiving from the government. However, unlike presidents after Thomas Jefferson, Jackson took the dramatic action in removing Native Americans farther west, away from the nation's civilized society through law and military forces. This act was infamously called the Indian Removal Act of 1830, a law signed by the president in May 28, 1830, that authorized the president to grant unsettled lands west of the Mississippi to trade the tribal territories regardless of occupation. As Andrew Jackson believed, its speedy removal would replace a dense and civilized population in large tracts of country, now occupied by a few savage hunters. It was this imperialistic and racist theme of removing an entire culture because, once again, feared that the two traditions and values will create an unwanted mixture. This can be seen as the natives are provided the ultimatum of whether you can assimilate into society and allow Americans to use their valuable lands and resources, or join the 500,000 other natives to march with little to no survival into the unknown land, which eventually will be called the Trail of Tears. However, while other tribes did not resist against the force, the Cherokees actually went to America's Supreme Court to declare that this was an illegal and unconstitutional, as it violated several treaties and even an amendment. This court case was called the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, a moment to hope for the natives and the American people that their culture was harmless and unjustifiable to remove them from their territory that they have claimed for centuries. The U.S. government has set treaties between multiple tribes, promising that there will be no invasion onto their land. But also, they were not a foreign nation, but a dependent nation, therefore violated specifically the Third Amendment. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that Georgia's statute was in fact invalid. However, Andrew Jackson was a person that could not deal with this defeat, even quoting John Marshall had made his decision, now let him enforce it, therefore sending him to sign an executive order of this act, enforcing the tribes away. In his annual speech to Congress in December 6, 1830 about the act, he stated, "The tribes which occupied the countries now constituting the eastern states have melted away to have room for the white, and the waves of population and civilization are rolling to the westward, and we are now proposed to acquire the countries occupied by the red men. Doubtless it will be painful to leave the graves of their fathers, but to do what they have more of our ancestors did. But what do they more than their ancestors did, and then our children are doing now?" While there's this argument that he was doing it in the name of God and economic reasonings, as many of his supporters were Southerners, especially with the population tripling, he even furthers it by claiming that they were doing a good deed of casting off their savage habits in order for the nation to become an interesting, civilized, and Christian community. Once again, using that religion as a primary reason for this push. But through this act, his personal letters between congressmen and political friends, he and the government clearly state their distaste for this race, even calling them red men and savages. These untutored sons of the forest cannot exist in the state of independence in the vicinity of the white men. If they persist in remaining where they are, they have begun to dig their graves and prepare to die. And this was a letter written from Alfred Ball to Andrew Jackson. Then this entire speech alone engaged heavy racial undertones with a sense of white superiority, switching between red men and savages to describe an entire human race. At the time, this Manifest Destiny reflected that he fought for the good of the American nation. But as time passes and cultures are integrated with each other, we see that the 19th century American government wanted to eliminate them with this fierce determination to conquer and expel any foreigners from the South in the name of God and national security. Sound familiar? This clearly displays Manifest Destiny left a powerless minority in a democratic society to suffer because America feared these tribes of this vast lands carried the potential to conquer America, a country that only belongs to the white people. And this can be seen in Remedies Andrew Jackson and Indians by Ronald Stotts, which goes more in depth about Andrew Jackson and his interaction with Native people before and even after his presidency. While Native American population has been dwindling down each year, the next president had a completely different target in mind: Mexican. James K. Polk. Now, the next president, another Jacksonian Democrat, was focused on an entire different minority group. During his turn of Manifest Destiny, with race supremacy still in mind, he wanted to take more land away from another society because of their continued belief that this was their right, whether it was God-given or not. With Polk's presidency being more associated with the movement, as he was able to complete the mission of expanding America from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, he fulfilled the expansionistic campaign promised to the American people by possessing the Oregon Territory from the British and the southern states from the Mexican government, especially Texas. However, the action he took to get both of these territories were completely different, as one was through peace and the other through war. Since 1820, tensions began to rise between Mexico and the United States. In the beginning, Mexico encouraged American settlers to come to Texas and buy land, and put it quickly, it became a problem when American settlers began to outnumber the Mexican population in the East in denying the Mexican government rules of no slaves, paying taxes to the government, and conversion to Catholicism. It got to the point where Mexico sent guards to the borders to control the immigration, but America ignored it and continued their settlements. Eventually, violence and rebellions broke out, which have continued into the Mexican-American War. But I'm not here to give you a background or a history class on Texas. It is the foundation of what led the Polk administration to wage war on Mexico. By the time Polk grabbed the executive seat, he made the promise in his first annual message in 1845 to fight against the aggressive country. He stated, "Since the time Mexico has until recently occupied an attitude of hostility towards the United States, has been marshaling and organizing armies, issuing proclamations, and avowing their intentions to make war on the United States, either by an open declaration or by invading Texas. Both the Congress and Convention of the People of Texas invited this government to send an army into a territory to protect and defend against the menace attack." While claiming protection and defense against Mexico's army, he waged it under racist pretenses. But there was no freedom to protect when in another foreign country and the people were disregarding policies set by the government. Mexico was a country that was still stabilizing their economy and states, the same as America when they were building their nation, especially after wars, so there can be no real claim of barbaric civilization. Mexicans were also minorities that were trying to save other minorities from violent grasp of America, and the United States government could not handle such an opposition. According to Mexican opinion, American Racism in the War of 1846 by Jean Brock, President James K. Polk justified the war against Mexico with the fact that it would be charged with American blood and shed upon American soil, even if it meant continued the rapid expansion of Mexican borderlands, including Upper California. Which is confusing to me when in James K. Polk's letter to Andrew J. Dawson on June 15, 1845, he acknowledges that the land was their position, as he states aggressively he will in all his power to expel the Mexican government from her soil will exist, and it will be promptly and effectively done. Just more proof of entitlement and racial domination led towards this war. When the two countries could not come to an agreement, Polk felt like he was forced his hand with battle, while according to the Mexican president, Jose Joaquin de Herrera wanted nothing to do with war, as he wanted to avoid war. But at the same time, he wanted to create an important message that their country's government will stand against the United States and will not be bullied and abused like they have done with other minorities within the states, such as the Americans and African Americans. In the country's pamphlet, he declared that his true intentions and interests of the country was to preserve peace, especially after losing Texas, and Mexico will be left in a disaster if entering this war. That quickly changed in April 1845 in El Estandarte Nacional, when he was allowed any more territorial concession that he would be open the door to the triumph of Anglo-Saxon race, the enslavement of Mexican people, and the destruction of their customs and culture, losing their dear and precious their nationality. But why wage war with Mexico but not with the British for Oregon Territory? It was in the cards to wage war against them, but instead the agreement came out of it. According to Jordan Graebner, in Politics and Oregon Compromise, the government dodged refusal to make any provision for the defense of the country, concluding logistically that the intentions of the president were essentially peaceful, not the slightest apprehension of war. Now, it could be argued they were over-fighting with the British, especially after the American Revolution and War of 1812, but if America was on this hunt for territorial expansion, wouldn't they do the same as they did in Mexico? That is because Mexican War was more than a fight for territory. It was built around factors of hostility and devotion to destroy what is considered weak in the United States. The idea of expansion was built around racist elements, and that is what drove settlers and the government towards the West, to prey on those who are considered barbaric and not living within American idealism. The American government knew that the Americans looked upon Mexicans as inferior beings, same as Native Americans, with the exact implication that the American desire blindly led them to believe that foreign soil was their right. Even before the war, Mexico had already had cynicism towards America after reading about their treatment towards Native Americans, but then stating humanitarian principles along with slavery happening in the background. Therefore, it was not to continue in economic opportunities colonies towards the Pacific Ocean, but to display the sense of superiority over these minorities, carrying no respect for these cultures and traditions because it was completely foreign to them, making it uncomfortable for the government to witness and see every day. So why does this all matter now? Why does it matter now, especially in this day and decade? It is because we have yet to face in our dark the real reason why Native Americans are still on reservation, and that manifest destiny is still continuing to prey on the weakness of minorities. We can mention how our national parks are constantly fighting over tribal lands, which is given to them through God knows how many treaties. We can talk about how the Dakota Access Pipeline crisis in South Dakota, and how industries and large corporations, even with government support, are still pushing to put their ideas and beliefs onto a land that doesn't belong to them, regardless if it's for the good. It is funny how we can look at these presidents that we have praised so much about, and it turns out that they were not who they seem to be, or at least their intention. They say it's for the American people, but it was created out of fear that the presidents before and after Jackson had instilled within the American ideology that eventually left devastating lands and population losses in the sake of preserving and dominating their own culture within these territories. Maybe if history can confront what it's been running from, stop disguising these painful parts with covers like religion or economic opportunities, then we can actually create solutions for these issues easily, changing the American ideology into a positive manner. Thank you for listening to Redesigning America. My name is Juanita Garcia, and have a great Air Force Day.